Good morning. Thanks for joining, everyone. I'll just give another minute for attendees to join, and then we'll get started here. Okay, it looks like attendees have kind of evened out here. So good morning to everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jonathan Raish, and I'm the president of the St. Louis Metro section of the Missouri chapter of the American Planning Association. On behalf of the section, I'd like to welcome you to our February lunch webinar. And before we get started on today's topic, which you see up on the screen, I'm just going to make a few announcements for the section. So our board, for those of you who don't know, we have 16 board members this year, and our section does a lot of important work for the profession around the region, but a lot of that work relies on our committees. So we're always looking for, even if you're not on the board, we encourage and really strongly encourage you to participate in our committees. There's something for everybody out there. So the committees are what actually the groups that actually do this work and bring you programming like we have today. So it's a great way to get more involved in the local planning community and build relationships with your peers. And to learn more about that, you can visit our website at missouri.planning.org and then click on our section page. And there's information. You can either fill out a Google form with your interest for the committee, or you can email directly one of the chairs of those committees. So please take a look if you're not currently involved in a committee. Don't hesitate. We'd love to have you join us. Next announcement is related to this professional development offerings that we have for March. We just kind of notice to watch your inbox for an announcement about our in-person luncheon for March 20th. So instead of a webinar, we'll have an in-person event. We're trying to mix those back in again this year. Registration should be open for that within the next week. So keep an eye out for that opportunity. Also in March, at the end, on March 29th at 8 a.m., we'll have our next Planners Coffee Chat, and it will be one of the book club events for that group. So a very informal opportunity to just gather, and they'll be discussing the book written by Matthew Desmond called Poverty by America. And that's at Panera in Richmond Heights at 6734 Clayton Road. All are welcome to attend. Next announcement is just hopefully you're all well aware that registration for the National APA Conference in Minneapolis for this year for April is open now. And lastly, hopefully you're all members of our section and are on our newsletter, but if not, please feel free to sign up to receive our newsletter. You can do that from the website as well. And let's see. Okay, I think those are the announcements right now. I will say, before we get going on the topic and I introduce our speakers, just kind of logistics wise, we will have a Q&A. It should be active for you all. So at the end, or throughout the presentation, feel free to ask your questions, and I'll be keeping an eye on that, and we'll try to moderate some questions at the end of the presentation. And then the chat function is there too if there's any issues, but please, if there are questions, try to put them in the question and answer module there. And there will be, you see up on the side, there'll be a poll, and I think one of the presenters will kind of talk to that, but there's a website to sign into for a poll, part of the interactive part of the presentation. So without further ado, we're excited to bring you a great topic for today's webinar. It's just titled, "It's Not Easy Being Green, Incorporating Green Infrastructure and Development Codes." And I'll remind you, if you're to remember to log your CM credits and provide feedback on the presentation once this concludes. So our speakers today are two professionals from local firm Burns and McDonnell. We have Kylie Clark, a certified planner at Burns and Mac, and Brenda Mackey, a professional engineer. So we thank you both for joining us today and teaching us something about this great topic. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. So I'm, again, going to give a plug. If you haven't already, if you can go to that website I'm showing on our title slide, pollev.com/BMCD. We're going to go over those results here right after Brenda and I talk a little bit more about ourselves. And also as I advance those slides, there will be a QR code and a link still to there, but I can see that I've got 10 surveys completed so far and 5 underway. So thank you to those that are participating. I'll ask to start us off for Brenda to tell us a little bit more about herself.
Hey everyone, my name is Brenda Mackey. I am a stormwater project engineer here at Burns & Mac. My background is experience in stormwater design, construction, and maintenance, both for public projects and also for private development. I am an engineer, but I'm also a planning commissioner for the city of Lenexa, Kansas.
Yeah. And so I'm Kylie Clark. I'm a planner here at Burns & McDonnell, and really, during my time here, I've been focused on stormwater and green infrastructure policy, planning, implementation. So Brenda and I have worked together over the past 6 or so years to implement green infrastructure, both kind of at a site scale, doing design and construction projects, all the way to the watershed scale and doing more of a planning effort there. So that's going to be where we're coming from for today's discussion. But with the poll, I wanted to hear more about you guys and your background with green infrastructure and where you're coming from. So I've got 15 surveys completed, so I'm going to go ahead and take a look at those. 17 now. Lovely. Thank you guys. 3 underway. So I'll go ahead and take a look. So first, we were curious about where everyone's coming from. I know this is hosted by the St. Louis Metro section, but wanted to see kind of what variety of participants we have today. Brenda and I are from Kansas City, and a lot of our work has focused on Kansas City. Brenda does have some experience more nationally. And I realize now a word cloud might not have been the best option for this this poll question, but I see Kansas City, St. Louis, obviously Chicago, I think Franklin County, Charles County. So it sounds like we've got some variety of folks coming from different places. This next question we were curious about is, what type of community do you work in? Green infrastructure implementation can vary a little bit based on, your community type. So we've got mostly urban and suburban, which is where you're going to see more green infrastructure, but we do have a couple of rural folks here, which is great. Green infrastructure can be built in rural areas too. Okay. So how familiar are you all with green infrastructure? It looks like we are mostly somewhat familiar or very familiar. And I applaud those who are have only heard the term and they're unfamiliar and they're participating today. We'll definitely be giving a healthy background on green infrastructure for those who are not as familiar with it to help the later parts of the presentation when we start specifically talking about the development code. And this last one is a more fun word cloud. What do you think of when you hear green infrastructure? I'm seeing obviously stormwater, bioswales, pervious pavement, sustainability. When we did this presentation at the Bi-State Planning Conference, I really loved this word cloud and I saved it down from those participants, and I'll be doing the same for this one. Health, climate, lead, greenways. Yeah, these are all great words, and all words that I think about when I hear green infrastructure as well. Okay, so thank you for everyone participating in that. With that, we can go ahead and get started. Like I said, we're gonna have a healthy background on what green infrastructure is. So I'm gonna kick it over to Brenda to first answer the question of what is stormwater management?
Yeah, so we want to set the base here so that we're all on the same page with what our components of a watershed system look like and kind of how I approach that from a design perspective. So typically how we look at a watershed system is through the lens of how we're collecting stormwater, then how we're moving it from the upstream ends to the downstream ends through conveyance systems, and then also how water is stored within the watershed itself. So to give you a few examples of what this can look like, let's talk about collection first. So on the left of the screen, those are probably typical collection practices that you've seen for stormwater. Those are different types of inlets. And those inlets then connect to a pipe system, which then moves water downstream. But we can collect stormwater in other ways too. So one example is a tree planter, which can also be a bioretention cell, and that's shown in the middle picture on the screen. So this is a way when we create more of that depressed area and have a curb cut, water can flow then into that tree planter and infiltrate over time. So it's collecting that water. Another way that we can collect water, as an example, is through permeable surfaces like permeable paving. So if we are looking at a lot of sheet flow from, say, an impervious surface like a parking lot or even a roadway, permeable pavers or a permeable paving surface can provide a point of collection in our watershed systems. So our next point is we're going to move that water downstream typically after we collect it, because our water always is going to move to the point of least resistance or to that lower elevation, no matter what we do. So one way that we do that is through our pipe systems, which is shown on the left, and you're probably very familiar with these. These again connect to your inlet systems that you are typically collecting your, say, parking lot or roadway runoff from. You may also be familiar with swale systems, and those can be paved like the example shown in the bottom left here, or they may be more grass or vegetated systems, which is shown in the top right. Another way that we can move water downstream is through green infrastructure systems and a more, I would say, manicured swale system, which is shown in the middle picture. Ultimately, all of this water moves to larger streams and creeks. And an example of that is shown in the bottom right. But just think about from a watershed scale, we go from smaller creeks, rivers to, say, the Missouri River, and then to the Mississippi, and we keep moving downstream from there. So that's how we're moving water through our watershed systems. It's also important to consider how we're storing in our watershed. I mean, this is a key piece. Before we developed the land, we were using all of our vegetated systems to help store that water. And when we develop, we need to start to mimic those systems again. So these are some examples of different storage that you may have seen in your watershed systems. Most commonly, we see a lot of detention. That's shown on the left-hand side of the screen. Now, for detention systems, this is where we temporarily store water and then release it over a period of time. So you'll see in the bottom left, even though it's not still raining, that water is there right after a storm happened, and it will be released downstream over a period of time. Retention systems are also very common, and we're seeing more of these, and they're important. That's where our green infrastructure systems come into play. They may look small, like our bioretention system that's on the bottom middle of the screen, or it could be larger, like our wetland system. And that's a constructed wetland system that's on the top middle of the screen. And then there also may be examples of retention under areas that we wouldn't normally think to put stormwater systems. And that's underneath our parking lots, underneath paved surfaces. And that's what's going on the right-hand side of the screen, is that area will be where we bring water in, we store it, and then we infiltrate it over a period of time underneath a parking lot area. So this starts to set the base for what is green infrastructure. And this is really where we can start to kind of define what this is, big picture, watershed wide, but then also understand that green infrastructure can collect, it can convey, and it can store water as well.
Yeah. So kind of to start off, there are a lot of different names of green infrastructure. So today you'll hear us most likely say green infrastructure, facility, practice, things like that, but you might have also heard of these terms. So there's green stormwater infrastructure, best management practice, stormwater control measure, stormwater treatment facility, all with their own acronyms. And then more recently, we've been hearing nature-based solution, particularly in the federal funding spaces. And this is a term that really describes well what green infrastructure is, and it's managing stormwater the way nature intended.
So as I mentioned before, green infrastructure does seek to mimic our natural processes within the watershed. So, you know, we started with the land not developed and we had all of that vegetation there to handle the water. And now we're trying to mimic that in different ways through the watershed. There's different scales that we can start to implement green infrastructure in the watershed. We can look at more small and simple type of installations. So a rain garden is a great example of that, where we may have native plants with an existing soil system. Or we can start to look at really complex, larger footprint green infrastructure that is very engineered, has a lot of designed components to it, and can even be smart and have smart inlets and outlets going to and from the system. The most important thing to think about when we're kind of considering how green infrastructure is implemented in a watershed and where is that we need a range of green infrastructure types and footprints to really capture and start to mimic those natural systems.
Yeah. And outside of how green infrastructure functions and how it works and what it does, what makes green infrastructure so valuable is that when it's done right, it can serve multiple purposes and provide benefits outside of stormwater management. And this is probably a topic that planners are more familiar with. But really, we maximize green infrastructure by maximizing the land use of where it's located. So we can have, you know, a piece of land that's being used for stormwater management. If it's large enough, it can also be used for green space for recreation. With our green infrastructure facilities, we can have connectivity between both natural habitats for pollinators and then built environments, providing that park-like space in maybe highly urban areas. Outside of maximizing land use, green infrastructure is also a tool used for climate adaptation. So having trees in your green infrastructure can reduce urban heat island effect. And really the basic function of green infrastructure keeps water on site rather than moving it downstream, where we're seeing more and more flooding issues due to heavier and more frequent rain events. So with that in mind, how does green infrastructure actually capture this rainfall?
Yeah, so we're going to walk through just quickly here by a common type of green infrastructure that you've seen in your systems, detention. Detention has been implemented for flood control for a long time here. And now we're seeing it implemented to manage a range of water coming through the watershed. So how does it do that? You'll see on the screen there a label of inlet. So we've got to bring water into this system in order to manage it. So typically our water has been collected in the watershed and then conveyed into a detention system, and it comes in through maybe one or multiple points into the detention area itself. From here, there is going to be a defined ponding depth that the detention basin is designed to. And that is tied to the outlet that's labeled on the bottom right of the screen. So we design these detention areas to discharge over a period of time, right? So it's a temporary detention of water. And that outlet may have multiple openings in it so that it can do just that and discharge downstream, most often after other water in the watershed has had time to move through the pipes and conveyance system that this outlet is connected to.
So on the opposite end of the spectrum, as far as an example for green infrastructure, you have rain gardens. And these are typically small, and you'll see that there's no pipe system to get water in or out of these facilities in comparison or contrast to the detention basin. Really, the three main things that you need for a rain garden are a depressed area, native plants, and some good soil. And so because of the simplicity and the fact that not much water can get here without a pipe system, these would probably best use for residential applications, where residents empowered to build and maintain their own rain garden. Now, this next example is bioretention. You might have also heard it called bioswale, bioretention cell, tree planters. But these types of green infrastructure facilities are somewhere between a rain garden and a detention basin when it comes to complexity and size. You'll see the biggest difference between bioretention and the rain garden on the last slide is that the bioretention cells do have an under drain, and that's so that extra water getting here can leave if needed. And it also has these extra layers underneath the soil to store water. So you can pipe water to these systems as well, instead of just relying on what reaches it from the surface. And that's mainly because you do have that under drain here to take water away if the soil's already full and it isn't infiltrating fast enough. Because if we send too much water here and then don't have a way for it to go back to the public system if necessary, that actually can probably drown our plants. And so with these factors of being able to bring water in and out, bioretention can really vary on size depending on how much water it's managing.
Okay, so let's look at one of these bioretention areas in action. So on the right of the screen, you will see a video here of a controlled test that we did at a bioretention area. And the specific vegetation in this area it's a tree planter. So this showcases some of the components that you can see at the surface for this bioretention area. So you'll notice you were able to see the water running down the curb line. So that's where water is collecting and conveying and moving towards that curb cut, which is kind of that rust colored curb opening there. And that's where it moves into the tree planter facility. From there, the water then ponds. So that's that ponding depth that this particular bioretention area was designed for. Now, on the next slide, it will show another vantage point of the same tree planter. How do we know if it's working, and why do we do these controlled tests? So what we are really looking for is this water is ponded up to that ponding depth. What we'll do next is turn off the hydrant. So water is flowing down that curb line and ponded. The hydrant turns off. We have this ponded area, and we're going to look for the time it takes to infiltrate through the surface and down into that cross-sectional mix of soil and rock through that entire bioretention cross-section.
Okay. So now that we've learned about how green infrastructure works, you might be thinking, what does this have to do with me? As planners, we tend to stay more in the policy, in the code writing, long-term plans. And to that, I would say that having green infrastructure that works well and does provide those multiple community benefits, it's really dependent on the planning stage. And outside of, what language you have in the development code, the basic question is, where are we putting this infrastructure? It's not just a site planning exercise. This ideally should be considered during land use and comprehensive planning efforts, because there are ideal locations to be putting green infrastructure. It doesn't necessarily belong everywhere. But we wanted to show you the tools that we use to help find ideal locations for green infrastructure when doing planning activities, whether that's long-range planning or approving development applications. So we're going to walk you through how we would use these tools when doing kind of both types of planning. So I'm going to use an example. Here we're looking at the eastern part of Kansas City, Kansas. And there's a lot of boundaries here that are hard to see on the map, including the state line. We've got Kansas City, Missouri on the other side. We also have the city and county limits. And so as planners, we typically stay within our jurisdictional boundaries when doing long-range planning. And so overlaid on this, we're showing the area plan boundaries. And then all of this is also included in the comprehensive planning area. So with these boundaries and your jurisdictional boundaries, there's a lot to keep in mind. And I'll go ahead and add another type of boundary to your list if it wasn't already there, and that's the watershed boundary. And so that's in that black dashed line. So these boundaries are going to cross both jurisdictional boundaries and planning ones, because in real life, stormwater doesn't care whether it's in the downtown or Missouri or Kansas side, it's going to go where it wants. So when you're writing a plan, how can you evaluate the data you have to make good recommendations for green infrastructure?
This is where I typically start with the watershed boundary. So this is that last one that Kylie clicked on and brought up. It's the dashed line on the screen. So from that, that's basically your high point if you don't do a lot of watershed work. So for example, everything on this dashed line on the inside is flowing basically to the east and towards the Kansas River in this point. So from there, I use the available topography data, and we start to develop flow paths through this watershed. And what flow paths mean is this is how water is aggregating as we move from the higher points in the watershed to the lower points. So we represent that through the line weight that's associated on this map and the color. So at the higher points in the watershed, you'll notice that those lines are narrower and darker. And so we don't have as much area where water is running off and getting to these points. But then as we move downstream, we have color changes, and then the width of that line starts to change. And we're getting more area that is coming to that point. And so we're getting more water that's coming to that point. Eventually, everything is mostly getting to that green, wider line that is near the Kansas River there. So that is where our watershed is moving.
Yeah, so if we're going to do a long-range planning effort, a comprehensive plan or an area plan, we can start to use these flow paths to conceptualize where green infrastructure might belong. So we're going to walk through our different examples of green infrastructure, starting with the rain garden one. So like I said, these are best used for probably private residential uses, since it's just managing whatever amount of water can get there from the surface. So if I was doing a plan, I'd probably look to recommend these in residential areas that are either upstream towards the top of the watershed and away from the flow paths. Because again, we want to not make sure that our plants are not getting too much water and drowning, because it does not have that connection back to the public infrastructure system.
But as we start to move downstream and we have more area that is coming to a particular point, we can start looking at different scales of bioretention to incorporate into our stormwater systems. So I like to also call these neighborhood systems because I think they work well, say, at intersections or as part of a smaller to medium-sized site development. So we've got a lot of flexibility of scale with bioretention systems, and we can typically start to look at them from our upper portions of the watershed through the middle portions of the watershed.
So then if we start to look maybe at the in lower points of the watershed, thinking about our larger facilities that require more space, like a detention basin or a wetland, I would look to place it along a flow path where I know plenty of water is coming to it, especially with wetland facilities that require a permanent source of water. And this is really where you start to be able to overlap that multi-purpose, multi-benefit use of green infrastructure. So you can start to look for locations that can be overlaid with other community needs that you're accounting for in your plan, whether that's parks or playgrounds or walking trails, and then kind of recommend it as together as a project package that really emphasizes that multi-benefit green infrastructure opportunity.
So let's look at some specific sites and just talk through again how we would go through this watershed kind of planning approach to that specific site. And we're going to start at the top of our watershed because we can still use these same tools as we work through. So you'll notice on the pop-up there, you can still see those flow paths, and the flow path is going down the street. This is super common, especially in, I'll say, older urban environments. Our streets are a main conveyance system, even if they don't have inlets and pipes on them. So for this particular site, we could look for ways to collect along that street. So maybe we're bringing water into, say, street tree planters or bioretention areas, trying to incorporate some green space and vegetation in this highly impervious area. Another thing that we could consider is what's going on the site itself. So maybe a rain garden would be appropriate next to the building. We'd have to look and understand how water is moving off of that building surface right now. We could also look for ways to incorporate permeable areas into the parking lot. So maybe that is paver systems or a permeable paving surface. Or we could look at if there are median areas or incorporation of medians, how to even incorporate bioretention into this particular area.
And then to continue on, kind of like a site application, if you're doing development or approving plans, this second site is actually an elementary school. We're kind of midway down the watershed, so we can see with our flow paths that there is a good amount of water coming here. And this is another place you can really lean on the multi-purpose, multi-benefit of green infrastructure. If you were to do something at the site, it could be a demonstration project to see how well it works. It could be used for educational purposes for the students, particularly for green infrastructure opportunities at this site. There's a lot of impervious coverage, a lot of asphalt parking lots, and maybe that's not necessary for this location. So you could either reduce the amount of asphalt coverage you have and return some of this area back to vegetation, and could do a bioretention cell potentially. Or again, you could, if you do need all of that asphalt coverage, maybe converting it to a permeable paver, and then having some of that underground storage to help capture some water that's coming to the site and then prevent the site drainage from leaving.
And as you move even further down in the watershed, for example, this particular location, which does have some buildings on it, but is primarily undeveloped, we can start to look at larger scales of green infrastructure. Key thing here is we would want to make sure that any redevelopment is not in this natural flow path that's happening. I've seen a lot of site development over the years that they take this and they're like, well, we want the building in the middle. And so they will try to reroute our natural flow path to a constructed flow path. No matter how much we do that, water will continue to move to lower points in the watershed. And so this flow path is going to always exist in some way, shape, or form. So we can start to look at ways like where is best to place our constructed features, but then also are there opportunities to manage a larger area than just the site development itself? And that could be through detention features, maybe some larger, even wet pond or retention features, or wetland facilities. So here we have multiple options that could benefit both the watershed and the site. Okay, so we were going to take you through just a quick real world example of a planning and design process that Kylie and I have gone through. And this is in that same watershed that we've been looking at, where we ended up designing green infrastructure into a parking lot area. So you'll see our flow paths here. We're zoomed in a little bit further. You can see that small tiny line, which represents where the top of the watershed, but this flow starts to aggregate quickly along our urban streets. So we quickly have 40 acres of drainage right there. And then we have another 40 acres coming downstream, and that quickly aggregates into the watershed. I mean, you can have 100 acres really quickly, and you have to think about, okay, when I get to that point, what is an appropriate green infrastructure facility to manage this much area? We're going to look just a little bit upstream of that 100-acre point into the area outlined in yellow. And this particular aerial reflects what is now built there, which is a parking lot. But we're going to dive into kind of the history of this parking lot a little bit. So let's look at what this piece of land looked like before they built the parking lot. How is stormwater managed here before the parking lot? Just think about that for a little bit. I mean, what sticks out to you in this picture? There's a lot of vegetation here that's existing. And so the only point of managed stormwater on this particular piece of ground is that inlet that you see at the bottom of the picture. And that inlet is actually into a combined sewer system. So that vegetation becomes even more critical because it's capturing and storing that water where it's falling right now, and not all getting to that combined sewer point. So, I mean, what's the first thing we do when we develop the land? We strip that all away, typically. I know we've all seen sites that look like this, where it went from highly vegetated to, okay, here's our new land use. Here's how we're redeveloping that. So because we have stripped away all that vegetation, it's no longer there to help store that water that is falling on the watershed. So we need to think about, with this new parking lot area, what are smart opportunities to help collect that water and potentially keep it on the site rather than getting it to that downstream inlet. So a couple things to consider. It's a parking lot, right? So it's going to have a lot of impervious surface. Are there opportunities to incorporate permeable paving surfaces that could be parked in over a period of time to have maybe a couple different functions, or you could consider it a couple different ways? One, just to reduce the amount of impervious area that is the site itself. And also there could be opportunities to then store beneath those permeable paving areas. So something to think about. Also, as you're looking at the parking lot surface, a lot of these have tree requirements that are around them that are part of that planning process. Okay, are there opportunities that you can take what would just be a tree requirement and turn that into a stormwater function? And that's what's shown on the right-hand picture, is that tree actually is slightly depressed, allowing for water to pond. It fulfilled the street tree requirement for the development site, but it also provided a place for stormwater to go rather than just continuing to run off across the sidewalk and down the street. So a lot of our parking lots also have median areas that are helping define that parking area. That's another location where we can start to consider if there's an opportunity to collect stormwater. So I will say with these areas, you have to look at those elevations within your parking lot. Is stormwater, is that water from the rain running off that direction? Will it get the water? Because ultimately, if we're going to have that dual purpose stormwater and vegetation, we need to make sure water is getting there because that's going to help our vegetation thrive. So you'll notice in these pictures, it is that fall time frame. These were right after the system was planted. So our plants look really small. And you have to kind of think of these from a designer perspective of this is the beginning, and we have to then water and treat those plants as they're still growing and getting established so that they're really performing both their aesthetic function as well as absorbing that water that we want them to do to mimic that natural system.
Yeah, so now that we've seen these examples of how green infrastructure can be integrated into a site, we can start talking towards the title of this presentation, which is how to incorporate green infrastructure into your development code. But we did want to give that background and kind of a overall look of the life cycle of green infrastructure, because we think it's important when thinking about what needs to go into your development code. I'm going to start off with another little exercise. One of the first things that I do when I'm doing policy work for stormwater and green infrastructure is just to look at the city's existing code and identify any potential barriers to green infrastructure is what I call them. I'm looking for language in, landscaping, parking, subdivision requirements that probably seem pretty typical to most planners and most developers, but in actuality, there's something here that would be prohibitive to green infrastructure, either make it difficult to be in compliance or outright impossible to be in compliance with your development code. So I'm going to read the original, and then if possible, I'd like you guys to use the chat function and let us know if you can determine the barrier to green infrastructure on your own. I'll give you, 30 seconds to a minute to do that. We'll see if this works. But after you've had some time to think about it, I'll go ahead and let you know what I think the barrier is and then how I would address it by amending the development code. So this first one, and these are examples that I have come across in my work. I won't name names and I have revised them slightly, but this is a real kind of problem and barrier in our development codes right now to green infrastructure. So this first one says that landscaped areas within parking lots or along the perimeter of the property must be protected from vehicular traffic through the use of continuous concrete curbs. So I'll give you a few seconds to put in the chat what you think the barrier to green infrastructure is. I'm seeing a few answers come in, and people are pointing out the continuous concrete curbs part. And you guys are right, the curb does impede the flow of water into landscaping. So those examples we just looked at of that site in Kansas City, Kansas, we did rely on being able to put curb cuts in to get water into both those landscaped islands and through the sidewalk. So one really simple way that you can amend your development code, and in cases where you have this language, is just kind of tacking on at the end, unless green infrastructure is used in the landscape area. That kind of gives freedom to the designer to determine, how water should be getting into those facilities. You can also go ahead and add more particular language, like this last sentence saying alternative edging may be used to allow for sheet flow. So for example, instead of having a straight back curb, you could have a reverse rollback and then have like some sort of low fence or bollard or something decorative to still provide that function of protecting that landscaped area from vehicular traffic. So this next example says that landscaped berms are required to screen parking from adjacent development or public streets. Berms and landscaping used in this area must not exceed a maximum height of 30 inches at maturity. So go ahead and put in the chat what barriers you see to green infrastructure in this example. Seeing a few different answers. Okay, so several of you said the berms were a barrier. That is correct. I also see responses about the height of the plants of 30 inches maximum at maturity. So these are the things that I see too. And so one way that I would address this is simply swapping the word berm for area. A lot of times as planners or in our development codes, we use berms to screen. But if we allow these locations to also serve as stormwater management, we're getting multiple benefits out of it and probably still reaching the same purpose we wanted to with screening. So I've changed this language here to landscaped areas. And then also to address the 30 inches maximum. I've said here, maybe there should be a height maximum for landscaping that would be within site triangles. We still don't want tall landscaping, kind of blocking people's vision at corners for transportation safety. But otherwise, is there really a need to have a maximum on height? Certainly a lot of native plants are going to grow taller than 30 inches at maturity. So this is one way you could address it. And then you can also just kind of make it further explicit that you can do green infrastructure by tacking on at the end that this could be a depressed area when used for green infrastructure facilities. It doesn't have to be at grade or higher than grade. Okay, this next example says that off-street parking shall be permanently surfaced with either asphaltic concrete or Portland cement concrete. So go ahead and put in the chat what you think the barriers to green infrastructure are here. Yeah, so you guys are getting it. So by specifically calling out these two types of impervious paving materials, it's not allowing pervious material options such as, permeable pavers or pervious concrete, etc. So again, I think this is a really simple fix. You can just change at the end that or permeable paving options, such as pervious asphalt, concrete, or permeable pavers. This really just opens up the door for a whole green infrastructure practice that was outright not allowed before in this development code. Okay, I think this is one of my last examples. Here we have language that says the area between the curb of a public street and the property line shall be brought to finished grade and planted in grass. Go ahead and put in the chat what you think you see. I'm sure you're starting to get the hang of it by now. Okay. So the barrier here, yes, is because that one that says it has to be brought to finished grade. That means we can't use depressed areas for green infrastructure. And it also kind of specifically says it has to be planted in grass, which doesn't have a lot of flexibility for using native landscaping as part of that green infrastructure. So to revise this, you could again just tack on the end or be designed for green infrastructure. This kind of opens the door, allows for flexibility to have different types of plants for it to not be finished grade. You could also be more specific if you wanted to, in having native plant list available of options that you are okay with being close to the right of way. So with that in mind, removing those barriers aren't the only thing you need to do to really be inclusive of green infrastructure in your development code. So I'll let Brenda kind of give an overview of what our picture perfect world would look like.
Yeah, so this is kind of our ideal ordinance outline to help tackle stormwater management comprehensively. And that includes really that integration of green infrastructure and thinking about green infrastructure as part of our stormwater management system. A lot of times I see green infrastructure implemented as we're just checking the box that we're doing it. We need to think about it as this is part of our stormwater management, and it works hand in hand with our inlet and pipe and more gray systems that we're used to. So take note that our ordinance language that's associated with each of these major categories is more process oriented. So we need to think about directing people to where requirements are and then how to make those requirements happen. So while our planning community, I think, is a lot more familiar with using the code, sometimes our design groups are not. And they're just looking for, okay, I need to go to the design criteria. And so if some of these other sections are located in other places in the code, they may never go and seek those out and understand how those design criteria requirements need to work with the other pieces to really end up building and then maintaining a comprehensive stormwater system, which is ultimately what we're all after. So our challenge is how do we get both those design criteria requirements and our code requirements to work together for stormwater management?
Yeah, so in our perfect world, we would love to see and write kind of what we call more comprehensive ordinances that address kind of the whole life cycle of green infrastructure from, planning to construction. But we recognize there's likely things listed here that already live elsewhere in your code. But again, like Brenda said, designers are likely not going to be familiar with how to navigate a code. But they do know to look for design requirements. So if at a minimum we can have at least references back to where some of these requirements do live, when the designer does go to that design criteria location, they can see where else they should be looking. And that will just kind of help them get in the habit of recognizing that there's things outside of the design criteria they need to be doing. And really, this is a benefit to us to be writing our codes this way, because if we are as straightforward in the beginning in the code as we can be, we can reduce the amount of confusion later on with development applications that didn't realize they had these requirements, and they'd have to rework their plans later on, which costs them time and money as well.
So we thought it may be helpful to consider, as we're talking about those different code sections, how they integrate into a typical project lifecycle. So why are those code sections important, and how does that tie, say, to a typical green infrastructure project process? And so we're going to talk through each one of these and kind of put those code pieces out there for each piece of the project lifecycle, and then provide some examples on why it is important.
Yeah, so the very first step, obviously, to implementing green infrastructure is planning and deciding which types of projects require green infrastructure. And those development code should clearly set those expectations. And this is especially important for planners because we need to be mindful of not creating undue burdens. And green infrastructure requirements can quickly become an undue burden when required of the wrong projects. So for example, we probably shouldn't be requiring fire retention or detention basins for people just building a single family house, or adding a small addition to their commercial development. Another thing to keep in mind is that unless you're a super small city, you likely have regulatory requirements that requires you to implement green infrastructure in minimum ways, and they're tied to particular triggers and definitions.
Yeah, so triggers, like Kylie said, are typically tied to regulatory requirements. And you may have seen these referred to as either a stormwater permit, or a lot of times you'll hear the acronym MS4 permit. So we're not going to get into the permitting and regulatory side today. I think it's just important to know when you hit that planning stage in a project, there may be other pieces out there that are triggering green infrastructure construction. So one of these is disturbed area. So a typical trigger for green infrastructure construction in, say, a mid to larger community is 1 acre of disturbed area. A lot of times you may have a trigger that's less than an acre, but be aware that this disturbed area trigger is out there from a regulatory perspective. And so kind of that example on the left-hand side, you can see a development that's underway. You can see that there has been a total footprint disturbed on that area. And then you can see that final impervious area, parking lot, the drive-through, the building itself. And that is the area that, from a designer perspective, we typically be looking to manage the water coming off of that area. And that would be your opportunities for green infrastructure in this particular development site. So disturbed area is not the only trigger. We also have definitions that do fall within some of those regulatory requirements. And a common one is development and redevelopment projects. So I think something to think about on development and redevelopment is that that's a common definition in the site development world. I mean, that's pretty easy to define on, okay, is this a greenfield development and we're building here for the first time, or are we redeveloping a particular site in a more urban area? But think about how this definition applies to, say, a capital project that you may be building, like a roadway project or a utility project. So it may be very clear that you need to implement green infrastructure on a typical site development project, but how does that apply to other construction that you're doing within the city?
So with those kind of regulatory expectations in mind that most cities or counties will have, this is some example language that could be good to use in your code. Again, this is in our perfect world, what we would recommend or like to see. So it starts with, stating that green infrastructure is required for all private and public projects. So it kind of starts to introduce that maybe we should be doing green infrastructure in the right of way in our public projects. And then instead of kind of making it confusing by having new development and redevelopment terms, we really base this language off of the activity, which is disturbing land in order to create additional impervious surfaces. And again, as planners, we particularly need to be mindful of not creating undue burdens for green infrastructure. So we want to require this of every project. Again, that trigger regulatory is usually set at an acre, but most cities are implementing this at much smaller triggers than that. So this is where we would have exceptions. So for, building additions or, small site development, you could say improvements that disturb an area less than 2,000 square feet is exempt from providing green infrastructure. You also want to think about those single family or two family building permits that I mentioned earlier. It probably doesn't make sense to have them build a bioretention or detention basin. If they want to build a rain garden cool, But we set this threshold kind of at 5,000 square feet typically. That's usually about the size of typical developments for single family. And maybe if they are building a McMansion, maybe they should be building a rain garden or bioretention if they really are building a lot of impervious area that's impacting the watershed. And then kind of a nuanced thing that can get complicated is this last exemption. So when talking about single family development, kind of but at a subdivision level, we do want to be providing stormwater management there. So typically as we have subdivision applications, platting, ideally stormwater management and green infrastructure should be provided for the subdivision as a whole during that public improvement phase when they're building that infrastructure, the roads, the storm sewers, the sanitary sewers. And stormwater management should be provided for all of the lots, assuming a full build out. And then when those lots, what this C is saying is when those individual lots do end up getting built, they don't have to provide additional green infrastructure because that was already provided for the subdivision as a whole at that kind of public improvement stage. So again, this is just an example. I'm sure you guys will have seen a lot of different ways to do this, but at a minimum, we need to make sure that we're meeting regulatory requirements if we have them. So moving into the design phase, after we understand what our project needs to do, we need to know what to design and how to submit it to the city for review. And I'll point out that one really important thing that we've seen a lot of cities miss in their codes is putting green infrastructure in easements. So even though green infrastructure on private site development is being privately maintained, they are playing a part in our public infrastructure system. And those cities that have regulatory requirements are going to be required to inspect those. And so they need access to inspect those facilities and then also enforce maintenance long term.
So from the design perspective, as you work with your engineering counterparts, I think it's important to make sure that the code points to the design criteria that you're wanting to use and vice versa. And that's really important to make sure that everything is talking. Kylie and I have worked with a lot of communities where there's been conflicts between the two. Or there's loopholes between the two. And so it's really your opportunity to make sure that those are talking together and working together to meet the same end goal. Another thing that you might want to consider as you're working with design teams is, especially on the stormwater side, that the criteria that your community is using may be a bit dated. And that's fairly common here or regionally. There's a lot of updates currently occurring. If that is the case, don't be afraid to listen to new ideas for stormwater management for a given project, a given site. Think about what could be specific to the site and how that would work. So think about your stormwater management as a system, not just checking the box to meet the criteria. And if it seems appropriate and it's had the proper reviews, it may be something that you'd want to consider a variance to your current criteria to make that system work better as part of the project. So something to think about. I did want to talk through a quick example from the design side of what you're typically going to see on a set of design plans, because I know oftentimes when you get a site development application, you may not get all the details associated with that. You'll get some of those sheets, but not get down into the details of, say, a stormwater management system or a green infrastructure system. So I think just consider that your plans need to include enough detail to clearly communicate what needs to be built on the particular site, and also to help get that built, right? So as the contractor is building it, these will be points that you need to go back and inspect during construction. You can't just tell on a plan sheet, hey, please go build a bioretention facility. You need to tell tell your contractor how that needs to happen. And so you'll see more specific details as is shown on the right for how to build the bioretention area that's in the median pictured on the left. And to go along with this, having detailed specifications for what you're asking to be built is critical.
Yeah, and I'll add, the reason why we think this is so important to be really straightforward and explicit with what's required on plans is because we're at this state right now, at least in our region, where contractors aren't experienced in building green infrastructure. So they need all the help and guidance they can get. And you can put some of this in your code. So this is saying, this first little piece is just saying to make sure that green infrastructure plans are fully incorporated into the rest of your plans. You know, there are a lot of designers doing development sites that aren't familiar with green infrastructure either. So you might find the one person who does and have them create a few plan sheets, but it's not really integrated at that point then with the rest of the plan. So when the contractor's using those plans, you know, putting heavy equipment, heavy materials on the site, and then they get to the green infrastructure plan sheet and they're like, oh shoot, I'm supposed to put a bioretention cell here and I've piled my tons of rock on it and now I'm gonna have to improve that soil because it's not gonna infiltrate. So that's why you wanna make sure that the green infrastructure is fully incorporated into all the plans. And you can have minimum language like this in your code to help with guide that. When it comes to like really specific plan details, specifications, Brenda and I usually recommend to have that really detailed list live outside of the code, just because as you get plans submitted, you'll have lessons learned on what you want to see, what you don't want to see, what you want the drainage study to say. So we usually recommend having that really detailed list outside of the code, but still have a reference to it here that gives an applicant kind of a mechanism to know that that resource exists and they can ask for it. This next one starts to kind of get a little bit more detailed in the code as far as what plans should be required to do. These are really basic things. So at a minimum, green infrastructure should be shown on preliminary and final plats and plans. And then again, I think the easements are just so important. A lot of the times I hear cities say it's a challenge to get easements on sites that aren't being platted at that time. But I think there are ways that that can be kind of incorporated into your city processes to make sure an easement is recorded for that green infrastructure, regardless if it's in a platting stage or not. Because again, it is critical that the city have access to inspect these, potentially perform emergency maintenance if the owner isn't maintaining as they should. And that helps the city meet their own regulatory requirements they have for green infrastructure as well. They need to be able to access. The second example kind of shows some more detail, but based on each particular sheet. So again, you probably won't want to include a lot of details in your code, but this language at a minimum says, you know, the design should be sealed by a registered professional engineer. And then it starts to list at a minimum basic plan requirements that, again, you can have more detailed submission requirements that live outside of the code.
So continuing through that project life cycle, so we just talked through planning and design, then we move into construction, which may seem like it's not quite tied to the code, but it is very critical. So during that construction process, we reference back to those plans that are created during design and the specifications that are created. But if we can create the best plan set and best specifications, if someone's not out there actually monitoring what's being built, there's no assurances it's actually going to be built per plan. So this is important because we need to consider green infrastructure as stormwater infrastructure. So what you're building needs to work. So it's important to consider what code language needs to be included to define that process for both inspections and then the resulting enforcement should you need it during construction. So I thought a couple of real world examples would be good in this. So let's go back to that plan view again of our median planter that we had in a parking lot here. And we've kind of tipped that here. So we've got rainfall coming down onto this area. And for this particular facility to function as it designs, we've got to figure out and make sure that it's built to get water into the planter. So that's kind of a big first step. Then we need to make sure that water is going to be able to pond within this planter so that it can infiltrate over a period of time. Okay, so let's look at one of these as built here, and we're going to reference back to that cross section that we looked at before. So this shows the different soil and rock layers as well as that under drain system. And something to note here is the elevations. So this is one of those key things that as the material is going in, yes, we need to monitor that as well. But ultimately, we need our surface of this planter to be flat. Why is that important? It's important because that water needs to be able to pond at a consistent level over that surface and then be able to infiltrate through those layers, just like it's shown in that top left cross section. So what we see on that bottom left picture, what do you notice is obviously not correct about the construction of this particular planter. All that water is ponding on one side. So even though our inlet point, you can kind of see it there, the curb cuts there on the left top side of the picture, water's coming into there, but it's all moving to this one location to pond. So ultimately, this starts to impact your vegetation health and how that's being established within your planter. So elevations could have been clearly monitored during construction of this particular planter. Another kind of interesting picture here on the right is you can see that the concrete that's associated with this sidewalk area was not extended to be constructed below that surface of the planter itself. So basically it's exposed. Ideally, and then per the plan, that concrete then extends down below that ponding surface. Where it's at right now, water is going to move in under that sidewalk area. So all of this in turn is not ideal. It's not what we want, again, for that continued function of these facilities. Things that we could have easily been inspected during that construction process. So another example, and it is also tied to elevations. So you'll see the details that are associated with this construction on the left and then what was actually built. And just for kind of context, the stormwater planter, green infrastructure, the inlet is right there about where the cursor is at on the screen. That's how water is supposed to be getting in to tree planters that are just to the left of where that great inlet it is. Yeah, about where the cursor is right now. So when you look at the picture on the right, is water going to be able to get into that tree planter? Right now, that surface of the street is below the gutter line. So the curb was built higher than the street. And so the only water that this tree planter is going to see is what ends up hitting on that exact curb line and then on the surface around the planter itself. So again, not ideal. And this is something that can be easily caught during a inspection process and then enforcement to fix. And so this is where it's important that our inspection information really correlates to our design plans and that enforcement piece is clearly defined within our code.
Yeah, so I would say most cities typically are looking at building sites through their building permit inspectors, but they're usually not going to be looking at the green infrastructure, at the public infrastructure in the right of way. So we want to make sure we do get the right people out there to be inspecting this during construction. So some example language, this first one says that by applying for a permit, you would consent to inspections. This is also just really brief, and it says that, the permittee should be notified if work fails to comply with the green infrastructure plans as approved. You'll usually see or want to have more thorough enforcement mechanisms and kind of like that inspection and notification procedure to be able to get those mistakes in construction corrected, like we just saw. It could include stop work orders, things like that. Another, I think, unique way to approach this is this language that I came across in a city's code. And it says that regular inspections during construction of the green infrastructure is the responsibility of the certifying professional engineer. So this is saying that that contractor has to retain the designer's services to be able to provide inspections and make sure that construction is going per plan that designer sealed. And I like this because it gives the reason for the design engineer to stay on for construction phase services, because they're going to be the person that understands the plans the best and be able to identify issues quickly. And then also this language provides a mechanism for the city if they don't think that inspection is thorough enough, or if they think the site's large enough to have that contractor retain kind of a third-party inspection. And you'd probably want to have language in here that requires those inspection reports to be submitted to the city weekly or bi-weekly or something. But this is just some example language, some things that I thought were unique.
So maintenance is the final piece in our project life cycle. As we're thinking about how, again, those different code sections relate back to green infrastructure. So a big difference with green infrastructure is our maintenance is continuous. As a comparison for other stormwater infrastructure, it doesn't need maintenance, say, every month, every other month, every week. It's maybe a 2, a 5, a 10-year cycle before much maintenance is needed. Especially during the growing season, green infrastructure maintenance is very frequent for our vegetated systems to be successful. So maintenance is why that easement language that Kylie described is so important. Access needs to be maintained to inspect how the facility is working over time. So part of that too is that both the owner of the green infrastructure and also the city that this green infrastructure system may be connected to need to understand what maintenance is required. So what is the best way to make this facility function well over time? And how do you document that? And sometimes this also ties back to regulatory requirements that may be in place.
Yeah, so just to give a little snapshot of another way maintenance for green infrastructure is different than maybe your gray infrastructure systems, is that you have to make sure that all the different components of your green infrastructure facility is working, or else the whole system will eventually fail. So, circled in yellow are all different components that this one facility requires maintenance for. So for example, if your inlet is blocked and water's not getting into it, that means your plants aren't getting water, so your plants are probably going to die. Additionally, if you have too much sediment or debris coming in and kind of filling up the top of that, that means water, again, is having a hard time getting through the surface and infiltrating and functioning as necessary. So we've got a little example of that here too.
Yeah, so if that process during design and construction doesn't quite come together, we may find issues during that routine maintenance process. So this is an example, again, another elevation issue. And if you look closely, you can tell that water is moving away from the infiltration surface of this bioretention tree well instead of moving into the tree. So basically, this is acting as an outlet for water instead of the inlet that it was designed to be.
So some of our last example code language for maintenance, again, this is a little tricky because we're not going to explicitly detail what exact maintenance is done for green infrastructure in the code, but we can have tools in there. And this helps to set expectations early, and it hopefully leads to functional and successful green infrastructure. So one thing you can have is requiring a maintenance schedule in your code, and this is developed during the design period, and that will give the owner the resources they need to know exactly what maintenance needs to be done, when, and by who. You can also have maintenance agreements. This is really a kind of a legal mechanism that gives the city, the right to correct, failing green infrastructure systems, and be able to recoup that cost. And then lastly, something that I've seen become more common is requiring annual certifications of these green infrastructure facilities. These would be done by kind of a third-party inspector, professional engineer, and that's done annually and submitted to the city so that the city knows that those functions or those green infrastructure facilities are functioning. So with that, we're at the end of our presentation, and kind of with ending on maintenance, it's why our #1 tip for implementing green infrastructure, whether it's in your development, code, or planning efforts, is to begin with the end in mind. I know that we're not all green infrastructure experts, and that's why I think it's really important to lean on your colleagues who have other technical specialties. Don't work in silos in your own departments. I think Brenda and I have had success in our projects because we are bringing two different perspectives to implementation, and they're both really important perspectives, but there's also your landscape architects and your communication specialists that all have a role to play as well. So with that, I will open it up to questions. We also have lots of QR codes on the slide. It's got both Brenda and I's contact information. And then that one on the left, we kept bringing up regulatory requirements. That link has some more information on that if you do want to learn more about exactly what an MS4 permit is.
Perfect. Thank you, Brenda and Kylie. Thank you very much giving us that crash course and taking us through how we should all be weaving implementation of green infrastructure into our development process. I know that a couple people made comments. The visuals and detailed process examples were very, very helpful. So thank you. Thank you very much for taking your time. And so if anybody has Q&A, we do still have 5-6 minutes here so left, and I'll try to bring these up here, but I'll give you a little more time to submit them. I will mention one was asking logistically. It looks like I mentioned CM credits for AICP certification. We have submitted those to APA. It looks like they haven't been fully approved. We haven't run into any issue with this before that they wouldn't be approved, but you might just want to check back in a week or so, and we'll also try to post an update to our newsletters from the logistical standpoint. Let's see. So let's see the other. Well, the one that just came in on Q&A was, how does road salt impact curb inlets for green infrastructure and the landscaping trees? Any policy recommendations on that?
Yeah, I think I'll tie this into kind of where Kylie closed. I think this is where it's important to engage your landscape architects to put the right vegetation in for the location that you are designing to. So they can help you troubleshoot that and get the right vegetation in that'll function well.
Yeah, and I'll add, this is where having like a recommended or preferred native plant list comes in. There are going to be native plants that are more salt tolerant, and having a list of plants with that kind of information, along with, that plant's tolerance to, water or drought or things like that, is important. So that's where, as a city, you could adopt a native plant list. And have that as a resource for designers and development applications.
Great. Thank you. And I saw actually in the chat, I saw kind of a question comment, Brenda. I think it was maybe in regards to one of your slides about, it says, how about when an existing roadway is redeveloped, redesigned, examples adding bike infrastructure, medians, et cetera. So I'm guessing this is kind of about, it might be about the threshold question for public projects. Is it, is it going from impervious to more impervious, or is it increasing impervious, that type of thing? Do you have input on that?
Yeah. So ultimately, the regulatory permits are going to look back to those trigger points. So if your project is triggering an acre and you fall under one of those regulatory permits, it does start to trigger then these green infrastructure requirements. So from a regulatory perspective, they are purely looking at that trigger point, not the type of project it is. But I will say that's why it's important, I think, for our code to also define what is meant by development and redevelopment. So development and redevelopment is defined in the Code of Federal Regulations, and so we have to lean back on that. However, I think as communities, we know the types of projects that we do. And so we need to think about how we lay that out and lay out our expectations in our code to meet that.
Great. Thank you. All right, we'll try to get through a couple more here. So questions, what does code look like to require testing of the green infrastructure to ensure it actually is working as intended? Or if not code, then what other standard procedure would you recommend for that?
I would say we don't see a lot of testing requirements really of private owners at all. Not saying that that's right, but I typically haven't seen that. I do think you could have in your code something along in the maintenance section, if you're going, if the city would like to have testing annually along with an annual certification to ensure it's still infiltrating, I think you could do that. But really, I think one of the easiest ways to make sure that these are working is just getting eyes on it. You don't have to do fancy tests always. You can just see, are the plants healthy? If they are, that probably means they're getting the right amount of water they need, and that means that the facility is functioning how it should.
I'll add to that too. Another just quick visual point is going out and looking at a facility after it rains. If water is still there, 1 to 2 days after it's raining and it's pooled, then it's not infiltrating. It's not functioning as it was designed. Like Kylie said, what I've typically seen from a code perspective is it requires either certification or a requirement of an operations and maintenance plan or manual. And then within those 2 other pieces that are outside of the code, you can define how detailed of inspection procedures you would like to see on that, that biannual basis for those facilities.
This is a little bit, I'll just read it off. So more of a comment, but rain gardens and biospheres are designed to fail. For example, they silt up and need to be disked. Permeable pavers need to be vacuumed. Pervious asphalt doesn't seem to hold up over time. It's a fear about the maintenance side of things and their costs being communicated fully to the end user, who might not be included in the maintenance plan early on, basically. So I don't know.
Yeah.
It sounds like maybe this was a lot of the easement discussion Kylie was, that both of you were harping on really about. Is that any other recommendations on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of a change in the way we're doing business. So this type of infrastructure to incorporate it within our watershed systems does require more routine maintenance. Now, they are designed to collect that sediment. You're exactly right. And they are going to require that routine cleaning piece. Now, there are certain different pre-treatment devices that we can do to help with what that maintenance looks like over time, but it really is kind of a paradigm shift. We have to change the way that we're approaching maintenance of our infrastructure systems and not expect them to last for years. I think when you're considering though that long-term maintenance, that's why setting those maintenance expectations up front through, say, an O&M manual and or working with a communications team to help, what is that best way to communicate to a property owner or to whoever owns the project long-term, what those maintenance requirements are is really critical for that long-term success, and really to then see those other benefits that are beyond stormwater for green infrastructure.
Great. Well, we are at time. There's one more quick question, but just want to thank everybody. If Brenda and Kylie, I think it'll be a quick answer, but just want to thank everyone for attending this February webinar. Again, thank you to Brenda and Kylie. So please stay engaged with our section through our newsletters and other events. We look forward to seeing everyone at our next event. But so if you need to leave, feel free. But I think the last quick question, based on the images, it says, on the inlets, would you recommend using any screens to prevent debris from entering the green infrastructure? So it looked like none of them had screens in all the images that
Yeah, the ones that we included in this presentation did not have a form of pre-treatment in them. There are, depending on how big the facility is, there is some different types of inlets that allow for debris to accumulate right at that curb line, and that can help with maintenance over time. For the ones we were showing on the screen, they were smaller footprints. And so those tend to be easier from a maintenance perspective, that sediment or debris does accumulate at the curb line itself and that curb inlet.
Yeah, and I'll just add real quick, kind of as like a wrap up to help with like the paradigm shift we need to see is that if we're not collecting the sediment and debris in our green infrastructure, we are still sending it into the public storm sewer system, which ultimately ends up in our creeks and streams and rivers, and helps to really degrade the water quality in our communities. And so really this regulatory requirements that we're seeing from the Clean Water Act to implement green infrastructure is to improve water quality and prevent pollution, stormwater pollution. And green infrastructure, like Brenda said, is serving a purpose by in part capturing that sediment and debris from moving downstream.
Good reminder of the whole reason for it, right? Thank you. Thank you. And Brenda and Kylie, thank you again. We really appreciate you taking time to share this info with us. So everybody, thanks for attending, and we'll see you around next time.